Right, we might get started. We'll deliver some coffees to those who haven't quite got them yet. Welcome everybody to TheoCafe this month. The topic is Unknow, Thyself, psychoanalysis and theology. So really kind of meaty topic. I'm sure a ton of different ideas, opinions, and lots of stuff to delve into and discuss together. Should be quite fun. I want to introduce our guest speaker this month. Usually Grug. Some of you know Grug. Remember Grug? Yeah, would introduce, but I thought it's probably not proper to do that, so I'll be introducing today. Dr. Peter Klein. He has his PhD in Kierkegaard, which many of you will know who that is. If you don't, then you probably will by the end of today, maybe. Former Dean of St. Francis's College, where all of our priests in this diocese train. Currently an associate professor at the College of Divinity? University of Divinity, sorry. Fantastic. And it's wonderful to have him with us today to present on such a great topic. So I'd like you all to welcome Dr. Peter Klein.
Thank you. Go ahead. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you all. It's nice to make the trip out here, and this is my first time here to Freshwater Parish. So I'm really excited to be here, and it's great to have this chance to chat with you all and to present some stuff that I'm interested in and to see what you think about it. So my topic is theology and psychoanalysis. So before I sort of dive into, the meat of it, just a bit of sort of, comments about my relationship to this topic. So I've been interested in, we'll get to the question, what is psychoanalysis? But I'll leave that as a sort of open question. So I've been interested in psychoanalysis for quite a long time. Both as a sort of theoretical, philosophical discourse about the human being. What is the human being? What makes us human? Where does, all of the challenges of being human come from? Both is that, but also psychoanalysis is also a kind of therapeutic clinical practice. So probably the two things in my life that maybe have formed me most intimately, I would say, is my involvement in Christianity, my involvement in the church, and my involvement in various kind of therapeutic practices informed by psychoanalysis. So these are two topics that kind of relate to me quite intimately in terms of the formation of who I am and my own experiences and my own life journey, and how I've processed the challenge of being the particular human being that I am. But I'm also interested in them on a kind of much broader intellectual level. And psychoanalysis is a sort of discourse that cuts across lots of different topics, lots of different fields, and you can find it kind of everywhere. So just to say that's kind of where I come from in my interest in this topic. And also that this is kind of an area that I'm currently trying to generate a larger research project in, and to do some writing in. Some academic writing. So that's what I do. I'm an academic. I teach theology. Still teach theology at St. Francis. And I'm trying to kind of forge my next larger book project on this area of intersection of theology and psychoanalysis. So that's kind of some of my interest. All right. To dive in, first I have a question for you all. Who's heard of psychoanalysis? Is this term, yes, people hear this term, you're like, okay, all right, good. You're at least familiar with it, you've heard the term. I'm interested, maybe some of this can come out more in the kind of question time, but maybe you can kind of shout out answers right now. When you hear psychoanalysis, what do you associate that with? What comes to mind? Pardon? Okay, psychiatrist, yep. Freud, yes, what else? Do I get the job? Psych testing, what else? Jung, yes. Yes, counseling. Yeah, okay, right, good. These are all some associations that, float around sort of psychoanalysis. So, as I said, psychoanalysis is both a kind of larger theoretical discourse about, a branch of psychology, about talking about what makes human beings humans, how are our psyches organized, how do we develop as human beings, where does the particular conflicts and challenges, they come. But it's also, it sort of actually began as a therapeutic practice, or as a clinical practice, you might say. So what I'm going to do, and again, I'm only going to present here for 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll just kind of throw it open. My main goal is to talk about kind of two main figures of psychoanalysis and some areas that they may intersect with religion more broadly or theology. The first one is, of course, the founder of this discipline that we call psychoanalysis. His name has already been mentioned. Who wants to mention it again? Freud, right? Sigmund Freud. I'm going to talk about Freud a bit, just introduce you to some of Freud's big ideas, in particular his kind of big ideas about religion. Preview, Freud was not the biggest fan of religion, so I'll be interested to hear what you make of his account of religion and faith and theology. And then I'm going to talk about, so I'm talking about Freud a bit, and then I'm going to talk about a more contemporary psychoanalysis. He's a French psychoanalyst. Goes by the name of Jean Laplanche. Has anyone heard of Jean Laplanche? You've heard of Jean Laplanche. Eli, where have you heard of Jean Laplanche? Just in your readings? Yes, okay, that's right. Absolutely. So Laplanche has written a lot about trauma and what trauma is and where trauma. Yes, okay, cool. So we got one person. So I'm going to talk about Laplanche. So Laplanche is kind of my recent interest in doing a lot of reading. He's a really fascinating figure. So and he kind of opens up on some areas. All right. So first, Freud. Now, the thing with Freud, probably what Freud is most known for is as the founder of psychoanalysis. And if you could sort of whittle it down and say, well, what's at the core of the discovery of psychoanalysis? You could say something about what's called the unconscious. Who's heard of Freud and the unconscious, right? This is one of Freud's big ideas and one of the things he more or less kind of stumbles across as he's beginning this new exploration, this new clinical practice with people, listening to them, trying to figure out what's motivating, what's causing some of their psychological and somatic symptoms, and he stumbles across what he comes to call the unconscious. And Freud will kind of later, reflecting on what his discovery of the unconscious has meant, he'll compare it to what he calls a Copernican revolution. So Freud puts himself in a kind of lineage of thinkers that starts with Copernicus. Now, what is Copernicus known for? Yes, right. So heliocentrism rather than geocentrism, right? Even though it appears that the sun circles around the Earth, Copernicus is the name for our discovery that actually, no, it's the reverse. The Earth circles around the sun. Freud puts himself in a lineage of thinkers that starts with Copernicus that he says provide progressive wounds to our narcissism. Copernicus is the first one who there's a lot of thinkers, but in particular in the kind of modernish period, Copernicus deals a fundamental blow to our narcissism. Narcissism meaning that we're at the center of things. So Copernicus, has this sense, we feel that the Earth is at the center of things. Actually, it's not, right? The Earth is radically not at the center of things. We revolve around something else, and that something else revolves around something else, and that something else revolves around something else. Is there a center to anything? Well, current cosmology says actually no. There's no center to anything anywhere. So, and this all starts with Copernicus, right? So there's a kind of decentering. Humans thought that we were the center of the universe, and Copernicus deals this kind of fundamental blow to our narcissism and says, no, you're not the center of the universe. Next thinker to come along in this lineage that Freud places himself in is a fellow by the name of Darwin. Now, what's Darwin famous/infamous for? Yeah, origin of the species, theory of evolution, right? So Darwin comes along, and through Darwin's theories of evolution, scientific theses, shows that just as humans thought they were the center of the galaxy or the solar system, and they're not, nor is human life the center of biological history, right? Humans just didn't plop on the scene. There's a massive, complicated, messy evolutionary history that massively predates us. So we're sort of decentered yet again, right? Copernicus decentered us from the center of the solar system. Darwin decenters us from the center of biological life. We're not the center of biological life. We're a late arrival on the scene, and we're not the center of things. So that's Copernicus, Darwin. Now, Freud places himself in the same lineage, and Freud thinks that he deals kind of the most intimate wound to our narcissism, which is that we think we're the center of our own psychic lives. All right, maybe we're not the center of the solar system. Maybe we're not the center of biological history, but surely I am the center of myself, right? And everything in my experience shows that when I, experience myself, I am my own center of myself, and I have consciousness, I have self-consciousness, I can do what I want. Surely I'm the center of myself. Well, Freud comes along and he says, no, you're not the center of yourself, because there's this thing called the unconscious. And this is kind of Freud's main discovery. The beginning of psychoanalysis is Freud's postulation of the unconscious. That there's a sort of, there's an intimate center to us that's not our center, that we are decentered at the core of who we are by various psychic, emotional forces that we neither can have full knowledge or mastery over and can never be fully transparent to ourselves. That the human being is made up not simply of consciousness, but of an unconscious. That we're sort of decentered from within by these various forces. So Freud goes and writes, one of his most famous books that he writes is a book called On the Interpretation of Dreams. And this is kind of the book that marks the birth of psychoanalysis. And Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. So he simply says, what is happening when we're dreaming? When we're dreaming, our kind of normal, everyday consciousness kind of takes a rest, takes a break, and it kind of opens us up to what he calls more unconscious primary processes, where this whole other part of ourselves, this whole unconscious part of ourselves, gets a bit of a hearing, gets a bit of a showing, right? And this is what's going on in dreams, is the unconscious is kind of let out a bit and tries to sort of speak itself in our psychic life. So that's one thing, and Freud analyzed dreams in all kinds of ways. Another big area that Freud talks about, the unconscious, is the whole area of sexuality. And this is another kind of very controversial, interesting, fascinating bit of what Freud wrote about, particularly the notion for Freud. He wrote a lot about psychosexual development. He wrote a lot about infantile sexuality, about how we develop as sexual beings is actually a complicated, conflicted, ambivalent process that doesn't just have a kind of, it doesn't just emerge all at one time, but it's a complicated developmental pathway. So he writes a lot about sexuality. Who's heard of the Oedipus complex? Yes, this is another sort of idea that's associated with Freud. The Greek tragedy Oedipus, right, written by Sophocles. Who knows what the story of Oedipus is about? Yep. Yes. What's the story of Oedipus, right? Briefly.
Oh, basically that he's son of
Yeah, that's right. So Oedipus is this Greek tragedy where Oedipus, the son, unknowingly marries his mother and murders his father. Right? So Freud takes this as a sort of, he talks about the Oedipus complex, and one of the things that he says is that that part of developing, into the psyche of the human being, is that a child's first love objects are within the family. Right? That every child goes through a phase of negotiating their emerging sense of themselves and how they love and who they love and what they love by negotiating a complicated kind of love triangle with their parents. And that all children go through this as a normal sort of psychological development, and that it's complicated and that it's messy, and that what happens in that kind of primal developmental time sets the templates for adult life, for how we will love later in life is determined about the childhood experiences we had growing up and how our parents were our first love objects. So that's another big idea of Freud's. Another one is, he develops this kind of like topography or structure of psychic life that's made up of, and this is kind of where he lands, three main domains of psychic life: the id, the ego, and the superego. Maybe that's also familiar to some of you, this kind of Freudian language, the superego, which is that kind of the punishing, part of ourselves. You should have done that better. Why did you do that? You're so stupid. You should do better on this. And then there's the id, which Freud associates with unconscious, which is the sort of source of all of these sort of seething passions and drives that are part of all of us, but that we have to kind of always keep at bay so that we can more or less figure out how to live with each other in some sort of peace, right? So the id is the seething unconscious that we're always repressing back down and finding what to do with. And then there's the ego, which is our kind of self-centered, and then there's the superego, which is that kind of punching part of us. All right, so that's just a fly through some of Freud's big ideas. Now, let me get to what Freud says about religion. Freud, as I said, was a big critic of religion and big critic of faith. So Freud was raised in a Jewish family, although he himself never identified as a practicing or believing Jew, even though his Jewishness was very important to him. But he was not what you might call a believer, and he remained deeply critical of faith, belief, religion throughout his whole life. His main critique of religion is that religion for him, and he kind of uses a broad brush to paint that, and that's one of the things you could actually push back and critique Freud, but he's using a broad brush to talk about religion. That religion for Freud is essentially an attempt to resolve unconscious needs and wishes. Is that religion emerges because these unconscious infantile needs and wishes that we're all sort of beset with and burdened by, we keep needing to work on them in adult life, and religion is one way we kind of collectively stage various ways of working on unconscious needs and wishes. He even goes so far as to call religion a collective neurosis. We collectively band together in neurotic ways to work out together our kind of deep unconscious needs and wishes. So, and he calls it collective neurosis. He calls it an illusion. So one of his books on religion is called The Future of an Illusion. So for him, all religion is based in that kind of illusion. And then towards the end of his life, he goes even further and starts calling religion a delusion, right? So he moves from illusion to delusion. And really for Freud, at the heart of religion is staging various kind of ongoing childish emotional needs, and that how even in adult life, these kind of childish fears and needs, they continue to live on in adult psyche, and religion is one way in which we kind of stage and try to work out and try to resolve them. So for instance, we all, as children, we're all born helpless, and most of our childhood takes place under some kind of care or protection of an adult or of a parent. Freud thinks that as we grow into adults, we still have this deep, inborn, childlike need for someone out there to be taking care of us. We have some need that we never outgrow this as adults. We have some need out there for someone to take care of us, and Freud says this is probably the seed or the kind of basis of most belief in gods or God, right? We need some big parent out there who will finally, at the end of the day, assure us that everything's going to be okay, that everything is safe, that the world really isn't as overwhelming and dangerous and awful as it seems to be, because God is out there protecting us like our parents once protected us from the wider world. And so as adults, we continue to need this, so we posit this figure called God. Freud he calls this projection, right? Freud he's saying that what religion is essentially a kind of projection of our infantile need to feel safe, and to not confront, for Freud, the ultimate horror of our mortality and impending death and demise. That's too much for us to bear, so we posit God as a way of resolving that. So he writes this in his book Totem and Taboo, and he does this by sort of analyzing various patients, and he kind of gets them to talk about those of them that believe in God. What do you believe in when you believe in God? And he kind of picks apart their language about God and where it comes from and how it functions in their life. And this is one of his conclusions, that it teaches us with quite special insistence, that is analyzing these patients, that the God of each of them is formed in the likeness of his Father, that his personal relation to God depends on his relation to his Father in the flesh and oscillates and changes along with that relation, and that at bottom God is nothing other than an exalted Father. All right, so this is what Freud, listening to his patients, realizes. Those of them that believe in God, it pretty much sounds like it's just a kind of projected father figure. That's how God functions for these people, a projected father figure. Yeah, sure. That's all right. Yeah, no. So Freud and Jung they started to working together. They eventually break out and are kind of at loggerheads with each other. Um, no, I'm still sticking with Freud here. So this is still Freud, and yes, and Jung does wants to posit a kind of a collective unconscious that's different than just an individual unconscious. Freud does also eventually talk about group psychology, and religion is one of the ways in which he ventures into kind of talking about a kind of joint unconscious, or how we kind of band together and join our unconsciouses and work things out. So I'm not gonna go down the Jungian path, but that's certainly one path that you could absolutely go down as another avenue of talking about theology and psychoanalysis. So yes, so thank you for the question. I'm sure Jung can come back up. So Freud, again, religion as a projection, the need to posit some sort of cosmic parent out there who's going to care for us ultimately, and for Freud, these are illusions. So, and this is Freud talking about religious beliefs. They're not precipitates of experience or the end result of thinking. They are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. The secret of their strength lies in the strength of those wishes. So religion is rooted in these kind of primal, what he would say maybe even childish, and he means that both in the sort of chronology, as in they emerge in childhood, but also that they're not fully mature or developed wishes. Now, that's kind of Freud in his book Totem of Taboo, Future of an Illusion. Later, Freud does come around to recognize that religion actually plays a really important role in human evolution, in psychic evolution, in the emergence of civilization, and that probably humanity could not, and maybe in still some senses, at least its current stage, can't do without it. And the reason Freud says that, and this doesn't mean for him that he now has some sort of great positive view of religion. He still thinks that humanity needs to ultimately outgrow it, but he comes around to see that it's not that simple just to sort of get rid of it because it's so deep-seated in human nature. And that civilization in some ways depends and has depended upon what religion and faith and various communities and spiritualities have brought to civilization. Because how civilization works, the very possibility of civilization, the possibility that we could have a collective human project and endeavor, it depends on us to some degree repressing and channeling what Freud would call our kind of fundamental libidinal drives. Or the id, right? That human nature is beset by kind of fundamental drives and needs and desires, and unless to some degree we repressed or rechannel them, we would all essentially murder each other. We'd all murder and eat each other, right? That's because there's this aggressive, selfish, narcissistic part of human nature that's part of all of us. And for civilization to be, we need some way to kind of channel those drives and reorient them into a kind of collective project. And this is one of the things that religion has done for humanity, is give us frameworks, value systems, symbol systems to rechannel our drives into something more collective and productive and not so destructive. So the fancy psychoanalytic term for this, and maybe again for those of you familiar with the discourse to some degree, is sublimation. Is that religion is a process of sublimation where we take our kind of basis drives and we re-express them in other kinds of projects, collective kinds of projects. Possibly. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I mean, Freud had his share of what we might call spiritual experiences. But he wasn't simply a dry kind of clinical person. He was deeply immersed in, he's very fascinated by his own Jewish heritage, even if he doesn't kind of take up an active position. So. So sublimation, right? So Freud identifies things he identifies work, right? Like professional life, work, is one avenue of sublimation, how we kind of set these energies and put them to productive use. Art, for Freud, is a whole realm of sublimation where these sort of desires are re-channeled and redirected, and of course religion. And religion for Freud is probably the form of sublimation that is the widest, because it can appeal to the most people, right? It can form communities, and the kind of everyday person can come along and participate in this project of faith and religion in order to sort of re-channel our sort of base drives into something higher, into something more productive. All right, so that's some of the high points of Freud and religion and theology. Now, the question, for you to stew over, is, does kind of Freud's critique or account of religion account for everything that religion is? Does it account for spirituality, right? Or is it kind of targeted at certain aspects of it or certain kind of uses of it, but it doesn't kind of capture the kind of whole thing? That's one question I want you to kind of sit with, because certainly that's been some of the pushback against Freud in his particular critiques of religion, is that he has a pretty reductive, narrow understanding of what religion is in the first place. And even if his critiques to some degree are valid, and I would say, yeah, absolutely. Like, it's pretty obvious that in some sense God functions as a sort of super cosmic parent for those of us who believe in God. That's one psychic function of God, right? Is a great caregiver in the sky to replace the parents we may have lost. Does pointing out that a psychic dynamic like that is at play in belief in God, does that automatically negate it or explain it away? And those are the kinds of debates, questions that people have about Freud and religion. All right, let me introduce you to one other kind of psychoanalytic thinker that I'm currently interested in, and then we can finally open it up and have a free roaming conversation. Jean Laplanche. So my friend Eli here is sort of Jean Laplanche, but for the rest of you, Jean Laplanche is a new one. So Laplanche, again, was a 20th century psychoanalyst / philosopher who's French, died in 2012. Laplanche's kind of main contribution to psychoanalysis is to sort of more fully carry through what Freud identified as the Copernican revolution of psychoanalysis. And within psychoanalysis, this sense that Freud started by talking about the unconscious and uncovering the unconscious, that at its most intimate spaces, human psychic life is not centered on itself, but is actually decentered off of itself. That there's something else at the heart of psychic life than our own mastery, our own self-awareness, our own intentions. That there's something else, a kind of internal alienness or an internal strangeness that structures what it means to be a human being, and that we all in various ways wrestle with throughout our entire lives. That is the source of psychic suffering, but also is the source of psychic creativity and possibility. Laplanche is someone who wants to more fully carry through exploring what the unconscious is, and in particular where it comes from and what it is. Now, for Laplanche, he's a deep reader of Freud, he's a translator of Freud, but he ends up being a massive critic of Freud as well, on psychoanalytic grounds. And Laplanche's main critique of Freud is that Freud continually loses sight of the centrality of the actual other person in the development of psychic life. How actually fundamentally dependent we are on other people for our formation as human beings and for our formation of a sort of psychic life, emotional life, is that Freud sort of starts to go down this road and say that we're fundamentally dependent upon other people for even developing, but in various ways he kind of pulls back from that. So to highlight the sense in which we're fundamentally decentered off of ourselves and fundamentally dependent upon other people, Laplanche talks about, he uses this phrase, the fundamental anthropological situation. To kind of get at or to point to what is most fundamental, or use the word primordial, about the human being. And what it is about the human being that makes the human being the human being. He calls the fundamental anthropological situation. And for Laplanche, the fundamental anthropological situation is the situation of a helpless child or infant in relation to its adult caregivers. For him, that right there, that scene, and this is where all of us come from. This is where all of us begin. None of us would be where we are right now as human beings had we not passed through this fundamental anthropological situation of being born into the world, a speechless, helpless infant in relation to an adult caregiver. And what unfolds in that relation is absolutely fundamental for making the human being what it is. So, as lots of anthropologists will talk about this, biologists will talk about this. One of the most unique, probably the most unique thing about human beings in relation to pretty much every other species of animal, plant, mineral, whatever, but particularly in relation to other animals, is that the human being, more than any other animal, is born extremely premature. More than of course, there's technically born prior to 8 weeks, after 40-week gestation or whatever. But actually, every human being, for Laplanche and for lots of other, is born premature. There's some animals who, they come out of the womb and within 10 minutes, they know how to walk, right? They immediately know how to feed, they know how to walk, they know how to do what, their instincts just take over, and they are the animals. Human beings are radically different. We're born premature, which probably has to do with the fact that because of the size of our brains, we have to exit the womb earlier, or exiting the womb with any larger would be impossible for the human body. So because of the size of our brains, we have to exit and be born in a premature situation. So we're all born premature. So we have this extended period of helplessness, an extended period of being fundamentally and absolutely dependent upon an adult caregiver in a way that far exceeds pretty much every other biological species. And for Laplanche, this is the fundamental anthropological situation, is that we're born into this helpless situation. And what happens in this kind of helpless situation is that we only come to develop as a human being in relation to our adult caregivers, that we're fundamentally dependent, not only just for the basics, they've got to give us food, they've got to give us clothing, they've got to give us shelter, but also for our psychic development. That we only develop psychically in relation to the psyches of our adult caregivers. And if we didn't have the psyches of adult caregivers giving us care, none of us would develop at all. So we're fundamentally dependent and on others. And one of the things that Laplanche highlights, and that he writes a lot about and studies and makes a lot of, is the fact that in caring for an infant, caring for a child, the situation is a helpless infant, and who cares for the infant is an adult, in particular a sexual adult, in particular an adult who has sexuality, and an adult who has an unconscious, and an adult who has an unconscious sexuality. And we could go into exactly what Laplanche means by that, and he means by sexuality more than what we just think of, more than kind of genital sexuality or what you do in bed with someone, right? Laplanche has a notion of sexuality that expands far beyond that. And he makes a lot of the fact that adults who care for infants are those who are full adults with their own sexuality and an unconscious, and they can't but help bring all of that in some way into play as they care for and raise children and raise, kind of helpless infants and children. And so Laplanche describes the fundamental anthropological situation as one in which the child, as it grows and develops and tries to make sense of this world, is surrounded by what he calls enigmatic messages. That the fundamental situation of the child in relation to an adult is trying to make sense of a world that is overwhelming, that is more that it can assimilate, and that is in particular enigmatic. And part of the reason it's enigmatic is because it's also enigmatic for the adult who's caring for the child. They are not fully aware also. They're not fully in control of their own psychic life. There's all kinds of ways in which their own psychic life spills over, exceeds, slips past their mastery and control. And all of the messages that are sent to an infant by caring for an infant or caring for a child are also kind of compromised by the adult's own unmastery of itself. And so the infant is confronted with this situation in which, yes, even though there's lots of kind of reciprocal meaning making that happens between children and adults and infants and adults, there's also a whole other dimension of what Laplanche calls the enigmatic message that kind of bombards the infant, and the infant is always trying to assimilate and make use of, or what he calls translate, And to some degree, that psychic development is driven by the need of an infant to try to translate all the messages that are coming from an adult. But inevitably, those messages can't be fully translated. They can't be fully assimilated. And so they sort of, he uses the language that they bombard the infant, they come at the infant, and the infant can't fully translate all the messages that are coming from the adult world. And all of this kind of excessive, leftover, untranslated psychic material that comes from the adult world, that is what will form the unconscious for Laplanche. Is the fact that we exist as children in a world that's too much for us to assimilate. And so it forms a whole part of ourselves in which Laplanche calls their sort of messages, their untranslatable signifiers, that get lodged in our psyche, lodged in us as something that we can't master and can't translate, and that this forms our unconscious. And that this for Laplanche is part of, this is what makes us human, right? And it's part of what makes us subject to what Freud initially, but Laplanche takes up this language of drives. So there's fundamental things that drive us as human beings, right? That as if we're pushed from the inside by kind of pressures and energies that drive our interest in the world, right? That drive our sexualities, that drive the particular things we're interested in, that drive our questions, that drive our frustrations, that we're driven by these things. And for Laplanche, this all has to do with the fundamental anthropological situation of growing up in an adult world that was too much for us to assimilate, and we translated some of it and made sense of it as we could, but there's always this kind of leftover excess that makes us at the unconscious. Now, for Laplanche, the goal of kind of, you could say, therapeutic psychoanalysis, if someone goes into analysis, goes into therapy, how Laplanche thinks of, say, the relationship between a therapist and a patient, or a psychoanalyst, or an analyst and an analysand, is that what that relationship does is, as he uses the language, it restages this kind of primal anthropological situation. So that what happens between a therapist and a patient is that you can kind of return to some of the elements of the primal anthropological situation, and the kind of therapist stands in for the kind of enigmatic adult in one's life, and one is able to kind of rework through how one formed as a psyche in relation to the enigmatic adult in one's life. So one can go back over, the translations that one made as a child in relation to the enigmas of adulthood, and work on them and hopefully break them open, loosen them a bit, and make way for better, more productive translations. That's how Laplanche thinks of the work of therapy. But he also thinks, and this is where we're now tied it into sort of religion and faith, he also thinks that all the time, pretty much in every cultural situation, all over culture, we are again and again and again restaging this fundamental anthropological situation, and particularly the kind of enigmatic nature of it. The whole realm of culture, the whole realm of art, the whole realm of music is all about kind of reawakening this fundamental relation to enigmatic messages. When think about going to a concert, or hearing a piece of music, or going to a museum, and seeing a painting that one likes. What's happening in that encounter with art is, to some degree, a kind of restaging of an enigmatic message is coming at one, right? It's a message that comes from another, and yet one has to translate it, one has to work on it, but it can't be fully assimilated. And good art is art that kind of maintains its own enigma, right? Good art is art that can't be fully mastered, because it brings us back to this fundamental anthropological situation of being in relation to a kind of productive, overwhelming, enticing, even uses the language of seductive enigma that draws us into self. I'm almost done, and then we'll get to your question. The connection then with religion is that religion would also be a site where this happens. So, and Laplanche, he doesn't have a full theory of religion, but he has a few suggestive, where he says that one of the kind of, truths that faith bears is that faith and faith communities are also a place where our kind of fundamental relation to the enigma of the other can be maintained, can be awakened, can be maintained. And you could even say God is a name for the fundamental enigma of the other. In relating to God, what we relate to is this sort of fundamental enigmatic dimension of existence that makes us fundamentally human, that we all went through and that we all bear in us to some degree. Yeah, all right, so that's kind of Laplanche. Now there's lots of openings there, and this is what I'm trying to kind of explore in some of my later work, about where you could go with this and make some connections and reinterpret some things. But I'll just mention one kind of episode from the Bible, for instance. So you could look all across the Bible, and you could, and this is, Laplanche kind of hints at this, that again and again and again in the Bible, what encounter with God amounts to is encounter with an enigmatic message. So to take, for instance, the book of Exodus 3, which is a fundamental scene of divine revelation that kind of sets a template for all further divine revelation, is when Moses is encountered with the burning bush, right? And this is in the Hebrew Scriptures, this is kind of a fundamental scene of divine revelation, where Moses encounters this. Again, the burning bush itself is an enigmatic, seductive message, right? What's going on with this burning bush? Moses approaches the burning bush. The divine voice speaks out of the burning bush, and tells go into Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And this is a fundamentally kind of overwhelming, enigmatic message for Moses. And Moses has this urge to translate it, right? He has this urge to assimilate it, to make sense of it. So what does he do? He asks God, all right, I'm going to go to Pharaoh. Well, who do I tell Pharaoh sent me? Right? He's asking God to translate God's name. Right? Give me your name. And what does God do in Exodus 3? Does God give Moses God's name? Well, not really, right? He says, go tell him that my name is, and however you want to translate the Hebrew at that point. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. Again, there's arguments for translating it both ways. But the point is that God maintains God's own enigma. God does not translate God's own enigma, but maintains God's own enigma. And this is part of maintaining this kind of the tension and the passion of the relationship with God, is that God is kind of enigma itself. And that's, you could look all across the Bible for that kind of template about what divine revelation is. It's not about plunking down information. It's about a kind of eruption of enigma in our midst that incites us to translate, that incites us to move, that incites us to see something different in each other. So think of Jesus' parables, how parables function. That parables are enigmas, right? They function this way. Think about all of the resurrection appearances in all four of the Gospels. They're fundamentally enigmatic, and they don't square with each other, and they point to some kind of inassimilable mystery. So you could point across the Bible this relation. Yeah, go ahead.
And enigma. Sorry. Okay. Many times, and I don't know that word.
Oh, yeah.
What does the word mean?
What about when some of you others of you hear the word enigmatic or enigma? Yeah, what does it mean? What do you think?
Decoding or trying to translate.
Yeah. Yeah, it means it can mean mysterious. 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 Difficult to understand.
Yeah, difficult to understand, mysterious, hard to understand.
Multiple possibilities. Something I can't quite, something that I feel pulled in by, but that I can't quite fully master or understand. Again, so think about this is what Laplanche. This is a situation that every infant and every child is in for a long time in relation to its parental caregivers. We're structured by a relation to enigma, and we only ever develop in relation to enigma, to something we can't master. All right, who else?
If we're going to go into talky question time,
Yeah.
I forgot to do this at the very start, but group norms. So, very simple, group norms. One is play the ball, not the player. You understand what you mean about that one? Excellent. So, we don't attack people, we don't criticize people, we critique and deconstruct an argument, right? Number two, just my opinion is not an answer, and it's not a contribution to the discussion. If you have an opinion, that's great, everybody has them, and we should have them, but we also should be willing to back them up. if questions are asked. If we're not willing to do that, then there's no point in sharing them, right? So 1, 2. Third one is, disagreement is not disrespect. Okay? Just because somebody disagrees with an opinion does not mean they are disrespecting you. You know, I think wider society could learn a lot just by following that one rule sometimes. I think the last one's pretty simple. Be passionate with your point of view. Absolutely defend it, but don't be disrespectful of other people, right? So deconstruct arguments, don't deconstruct the person who gave them. Great. Cheers. Pleasure.
Yeah, go for it.
Try and talk through this. Yeah.
I can speak up.
Well, it's just not going to go through the live stream.
All right. My ancestors have walked this land for 65,000 years. What does your Frenchman have to say about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, like,
I think we've been doing something right for 65,000 years.
Yeah,
Doing
sure.
right.
no, and one of the things about, I mean, not anywhere that I know about does Laplanche talk about indigenous cultures or indigenous spiritualities. But one of the things I take that his framework is helpful for is saying that that like, and what he means by the fundamental anthropological situation is that even those cultures that have been around for 65,000 years, all of them, nobody gets to adulthood without passing through infancy. And therefore, all of culture, all of spirituality is in some way marked by this process of having passed through an infancy and how that structures whatever adult spirituality culture emerges on the other side of it. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, you know, so you could absolutely just simply, I mean, yeah, of course you'd want to be careful and not some kind of reductive, dismissive way. But I take it that Laplanche's framework is a framework in which you could, you know, talk about, this is also what, you know, indigenous spiritualities are witnessing to. Is that it also is full of what you might call enigmatic messages. You know, the way in which, you know, in particular, and one hallmark of many indigenous spiritualities is the way in which the earth itself and the land itself becomes a source of communication, right? That the earth speaks, the land speaks, the animals speak. They aren't just mute, dead matter, but they're imbued with a communication, right? And this is one way to kind of expand out this kind of framework, that they witness the fact that to be human, right, is to have the possibility of all of creation being a source of messages, right, a kind of enigmatic messaging, in relation to which we have to build various processes of translation and retranslation and creativity and discovery. So yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think Laplanche says somewhere that a child can develop without parents. They can't develop without adults. So it's not as though you need the kind of typical, you know, nuclear family setup, you know, 2 parents, home, picket fence, whatever. He's like, that's none of that's required for development. But a child can't develop without encountering the adult world in some way or another. Children do not develop on their own. Yeah, of course, and you know, and I'm sure there's, you know, all of that. So, but it's certainly not a, you know, it's certainly not a recommendation for any particular vision of, you know, children have to have this developed properly, but children, for Laplanche, you have to be in contact with the adult world, because the adult world is what kind of, you know, one, it provides the safety and regulation needed for kind of basic needs, but then it's also what drives the psychic development of an infant, of a child, in relation to this world that exceeds it. So yeah. Yeah. Well, of course, yes. Absolutely it is. I mean, it sort of is a chicken or an egg question, like, did human communities develop the way they did in order to be able to provide this kind of long latency period of the human infant? Or did the long latency period of the human infant provide the impetus for organizing human communities in the way that? So yeah, so again, you could probably have people arguing, and in some ways, I don't know if it's fruitful to choose between two of those things. These probably things developed symbiotically, right? And again, it probably has to do with evolutionary biologists will tell us, with the development of language, and that once language capacity comes on the scene, that drives brain development in a certain kind of way, and even the size of the brain happens. So once language starts, the brain gets bigger. Once the brain gets bigger, the human infant has to be born more premature. So all these things are sort of feeding back along.
Has he ever spoken about the effect of this kind of enigmatic understanding being used um, with those who would like to have conflict between religions, and basically that being a defense mechanism against this idea of the enigmatic? Because let me kind of explain a bit more. Within our own faith communities, I think we would be quite honest with each other in saying that nobody really fully understands and knows God, right? I think even the most fundamental literalist would at least try and show their humility by stating that. However, if they want to create conflict between another faith community understanding, they would then bolster this understanding that they know God better than others. So it's almost like a defense mechanism against the enigmatic. Apart from when they're with their own community, they can then be honest and open about it.
No, that's right. I mean, that's one way to kind of interpret, that yeah, there is this drive to translate, right? This drive to create, and that's also an important part of being human, right? To create meaning, to name things, to create stories, to tell stories, to create symbols, to create meaning. I suppose Laplanche's point is that all of that can never fully master or overcome the kind of fundamental enigma of being in relation to otherness. Whether we talk about other human beings, whether we talk about other cultures, whether we talk about God as the sort of cosmic other, the world itself is the other, that there's something excessive that we can never simply assimilate fully in any of our stories or narratives. And yet it's what you're saying is it's precisely the fear of that, the fear that to some degree we always fail, that leads us to cling ever more tightly to our own translations, ever more tightly to our own sense of things, ever more tightly to our own concepts. Whereas if we could sort of develop a tolerance for our own enigma, right? And this is Laplanche's point, is that enigma is not just out there, it's deeply in here. Is that, again, if we could develop a tolerance for our own enigmas, for the enigmatic nature of even myself, how I'm a stranger even to myself, that will hopefully help me tolerate the strangeness of another person, right? And at least ease the need to try to master them. Yet, I don't know. I mean, he certainly would not. He certainly would not mark any. This is the moment for everybody, right? Or that because different cultures define the transition to adulthood differently. And this would probably be how he would kind of answer this kind of question. He'd be saying that part of what it means to be an adult is to situate oneself in relation to all the markers and codes and rituals for being an adult in any given culture. That would differ from culture to culture, right? And all that kind of stuff. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, like becoming a mature adult would have something to do with a kind of tolerance or an increasing tolerance for uncertainty, an increasing tolerance for, um, yeah, the enigmatic in oneself and one another. Absolutely. So yeah. So yes, I live with 13-year-olds, so I'm well acquainted with, the days of certainty. I know all things. I know absolute right and wrong. I'm the arbiter. So, yeah. So absolutely. The other thing, we'll get here. Just to return to this question. I mean, the other thing, but the interesting thing about Laplanche is that for Laplanche, there's never a point in which you simply transition out of childhood into adulthood, right? And that to be an adult is not, again, this goes back to this notion of the Copernican decentering, is that even adults, even the most mature, fully developed adult, is not simply centered in their own adult being. But there's this kind of what you might call the kind of infantile trace or dimension that maintains throughout all being human, right? There's this fundamental part of ourselves that we never overcome. Um, the fundamental way in what it means for us to be a human being and to have a psyche and to have desire is always dependent and always is continually reactivating that fundamental anthropological situation. So yes, there are, it's meaningful to talk about differences between childhood and adulthood. But it's never simply a clean break, and there's parts of childhood that always will continue on into adulthood. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, well, this is one of the questions I'm interested in thinking about is how do you relate Laplanche's sense of otherness and the other, which, yeah, which for him, he's most immediately referring to the others that we encounter in the fundamental anthropological situation, and how our encounters with other human others and otherness restage and reactivate that. How do you forge connections between that sense of otherness and the otherness of someone like Tillich or theologians, Buber, Otto, idea of the holy, Buber's I and thou, kind of stuff. What are the connections, and how do you make sense of what these other thinkers want to say about the fundamental importance of otherness or God as other, God as wholly other, and how that relates to how you might say the big other relates to the little other. Big others relates to little others. Yeah, absolutely. So And the other, and this is the other interesting question is, and that this puts on the table, and this gets us to what Freud was saying, but then also Laplanche. I'm interested in what you think about this. Is that whatever we mean by our relationship to God, right, our relationship to the divine, to the holy, to the sacred, part of what this puts on the table is that you can never bypass, whatever that means for an adult, can never bypass this very complex developmental question about how we learn to relate to our others as a child, about how we learn to relate to otherness, to the enigmatic nature of otherness that comes at us from the adult world, and that there is that you can never simply bypass that our relation to God is always in some sense also entangled with and involved with this whole arena that kind of Freud and Laplanche have been talking about. There's no way to kind of cleanly separate, well, this is what I'm relating to when I relate to God. Relation to God is all entangled with and mixed up how we relate to others in our lives as well. Yeah.
Relating to that, but also the way that it is for their children, and adults speak to them, and then Christ says the end of the kingdom is heaven, and that's the kingdom of society. So, for whom the children are, they're full of joy, and then it's the adults walking away and being
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, children are full of joy. They're also full of misery as well.
Yeah.
So, we like to romanticize childhood, but childhood is also a side of trauma and misery, just as it's a side of joy and carefreeness. Yeah, Clay.
There's a couple of pieces of scripture that I thought, what you've been talking about could add even more weight to. One is the whole idea out of one of the Gospels when Jesus is on the cross. He says, "Forgive them; they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing." And if you place this whole idea of the anthropological enigma onto that, I think you've got like tomes that you could write. It was one, and the other one is quite different to that, but kind of related. Is when Pontius Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And then Jesus simply replies with, "You say that I am." In that kind of frame that you've been speaking of, I think there's some really powerful depth and stuff that could be involved in that.
Even Jesus' silence in relation to Pilate there's an enigmatic dimension to that, right? Refusing to answer. Yep. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yes, right. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and again, it points to again these complicated entanglements that I'm trying to kind of get at between kind of what you might say is, I mean, one way to stage the question is between kind of psychic development as a human being and kind of faith development is where do they intersect? How does one relate to the other? So you asked about like revelation, like in moments of revelation in childhood. Was that the question about where might? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. I get what you're saying. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes. So, yes, Jews, Christians, and Muslims point to this notion of divine self-revelation. God is the one who reveals God to us. But in all three of those faiths, there is also a fundamental and irreducible element that what is revealed in Revelation is mystery. It's not as though God is mysterious apart from Revelation, and then Revelation simply makes everything clear to us. No, what Revelation is the bringing near to us of the mystery. It's engaging us with the enigma of God. So both Jews, Christians, and Muslims all have traditions of what's called negative or apophatic theology, which is emphasizing that God is an unsayable, infinite, inscrutable mystery, and that at the end of the day we fundamentally cannot say what God is because God is a mystery, and that what Revelation is bringing us into kind of contact with the fire of that mystery. Yes, it is Christ, right? Christ. Yes, but Christ is the sort of central revelation for Christians, but also Christ is the fundamental enigma, right? God made flesh. What is more paradoxical, enigmatic, inestimable than the Christian confession that the infinite creator God has become flesh in a finite human being? That's the fundamental enigma, right? What is that, and even Jesus' climactic question, right? Who do you say that I am, right? It stages our relation to that enigma. You have to answer that question. So it's that even that the central Christian moment of revelation stages a deep paradox and a deep enigma, and even further, the sort of, the life history of Jesus Christ. Right? He ends up dying on a cross as a criminal. That there is no kind of triumphant moment of revelation. It's a deeply enigmatic story where the Messiah of Israel, the incarnation of God, dies a miserable death on the outskirts of Jerusalem as a blasphemer and a criminal. And yes, there's the resurrection, but as I said, the resurrection appearances in the New Testament are, again, they're not triumphant moments of clarity and revelation. They're further turns of the enigma, right? And I mean, you think particularly my favorite of all the gospel endings, the Gospel of Mark, the way the Gospel of Mark ends. It ends in, and the women went to the tomb, and it was empty, and they fled in terror and fear, and said nothing to anyone. And that's it. Now, yes. Yes, that's what I mean. Yes? Yes, that's right. It is. And the whole notion of the messianic secret in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is continually saying, don't tell anyone about me. Because inevitably you're going to say the wrong thing. Inevitably you're going to misconstrue things. You're going to turn me into something that I'm not. So continually in Mark, Christ is continually kind of, again, maintaining his own enigma. And it's precisely in and through that we are to find the revelation of God. Not as some sort of tidy, finished, packaged thing, but as and the whole, lots of scholars have written about the structure of the Gospel of Mark is the way that it's supposed to work is, the women encountered the empty tomb at the end of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is not here. What do the angels say? He has gone ahead of you into Galilee. Now, this is different from the other Gospels where Jesus ascends into heaven, right? In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus doesn't fly up into heaven. Jesus goes back to Galilee, which is where the whole story of Mark began, right? So there's this sense in which you will find Jesus as you go back and do the whole story again, follow Christ through the whole story, right? So it's almost that Christ is always slipping out of your grasp, and you have to go back to Galilee, where you will find him there, right? Retrotting the path to the way to the cross that got you there, right? So there's this. Now, of course, the ending of Mark and the original ending of Mark is 16:8, right? And then there's a later ending that was produced to sort of suture up the gaping hole that Mark ended with. Most scholars recognize that was a later edition where Jesus, handles snakes and does lots of interesting things, right? But that's not the original ending of Mark. Yeah. But how is that not an enigma? Yeah, one thing I might say is again this kind of relates to Laplanche's stuff about at the center of every human being and the center of every psyche is this sort of enigmatic excess implanted in us from the other that we're never fully able to assimilate, which means that there's this enduring kind of unassimilable core of ourselves that we can never quite get to grips with, and that make us all the kind of idiosyncratic, weird person that we are, right? That each of us is, right? That forms all of our quirks, all of our strange desires, all of our particular interests, all of the, that forms the sort of angular, weird person that each of us is. Yeah, so, but I wonder if you kind of follow the planche, one of the kind of, what might open, what communities of faith at their best might open, is a way of relating to each other, a way of communing with each other, and in communing with each other, communing with God, in a way that isn't defensive or afraid of all of that idiosyncratic, weird, enigmatic material about myself and about you. And that communities of faith, because when we go out into the world, the everyday world of work, we all kind of slot into various identities, right? We all take on various identities, right? I'm a academic, or I'm a father, or I'm a Christian, or I'm an Australian, or I'm an American, And these identities, we kind of step into these identities, and we live our lives through them. And they do things for us. They enable us in various ways. But they never really capture us, right? They never fully fit. Every single identity that we wear never fully fits the sort of singular, angular, enigmatic, idiosyncratic selves that we are. And we're always kind of having to slice off parts of ourselves or kind of hide parts of ourselves to fit into the roles that we all have to play. We all have to do that, right? That's part of getting on in the world. But one of the gifts that communities of faith may be able to bring, and that's something like the gift of faith, is that we can actually, when we gather together, we can sort of suspend those things for a bit. And we can actually be idiosyncratic and weird together. And that, part of what, Christian tradition means by, say, like justification by faith alone, right? The fact that, and someone mentioned Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich sums up, the message of justification by faith alone with the message, you are accepted, simply as you are, with all of your weird, enigmatic, excessive self, and you are loved as that weird, enigmatic, excessive self that never quite fits into any fully of the identities. Like that could be what communion of the saints means, right? And communion with God means is that all of the identities in which we inevitably articulate ourselves through, none of them are sufficient, none of them are final, none of them really meet our deepest desires. Where are the communities where we can actually approach each other in that more? Sure. Yeah, no, that's beautiful, Eli. And yeah, and I think one of the, you mentioned this being made in the image of God, and it's funny because particularly the Christian tradition has used this theological concept of being made in the image of God as a way to kind of pick out the human being, as we kind of know what the human being is in distinction from everything else because it's made in the image of God. We use it, the Christian tradition uses it as this sort of marker of human uniqueness or human superiority, right? We're superior to all the other animals and plants and minerals and vegetables, whatever, because we're made in the image of God. The Jewish tradition doesn't really use the concept that way. It doesn't really develop that same kind of heft in the Jewish tradition. And possibly because in the Jewish tradition, they maintain a closer relationship to the irony of the whole concept. Because the irony in the Hebrew scriptures is that, yes, Genesis says human beings are made in the image of God, but then across the rest of the Jewish scriptures, you have the insistence that God has no image, right? That you can't image God. And if you image God, you're an idolater, right? If you pin down God in some sort of form or some sort of image, you've reduced, again, the enigmatic mystery of God into something assimilable, something you can master. And that's that's what's prohibited, right? So again, the Christian tradition has sometimes tended to turn the image of God into something that it thinks it can know about the human being. But really, it's a pointer to the kind of mysterious depth and heartland of the human being, right? That we're this open, never finished mystery. That being made in the image of God, means that in some sense, there is no image, right? Yes, it's the image of that which has no image, right? That's the irony. That's the irony. Yeah. Go homework. Anyone else? Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, one, like for me, the best forms of therapy, whether they're psychoanalytic therapy or other forms of psychotherapy, right? A thousand options. The best forms of therapy, whatever they are never about the therapist telling the patient, the client, what to think, what to believe, how to live, right? As soon as you get into some mode of, well, here's what I think is best for you, that just find a therapist. It's bad. That's de facto bad therapy. If the therapist is telling you that what good therapy does provides a kind of breathing space for you to explore what's coming up in your life, for you to explore the conflicts, and a therapist or an analyst is there to facilitate that kind of exploration. And yes, they may be able to kind of frame things or interpret things, but the main thing is that they're to provide a kind of holding space for you to do the work, right? It's the person themselves who has to do the work of sorting through whatever conflicts they're bringing with them, whatever issues are coming up for them, whatever history they want to go back over. It's for them to do the work, and a good therapist facilitates the space for them to do that work and arrive at whatever conclusions they arrive at, right? So that's to say, but it is a, you say, is there a day, but there, that's always to some degree a risk, right? And particularly for forms of faith and Christianity or other forms of faith that trade on simply compliance, right? Or you have to believe this, right? Or else you're a bad whatever. Or to be part of this community, you have to maintain this belief or this version of the belief. Being invited into a space, and this is what psychoanalysis is, being invited into a space in which the only rule is say whatever you want, explore whatever you want, whatever comes to mind. Say that's a bold invitation, right? To explore, and you may end up coming to a space where you say, well, this form of belief, it doesn't work for me. This form of belief, it no longer is compelling for me for X, Y, or Z reasons. Yeah, so you could always come out the end of the therapeutic process deconstructing something, reformulating something, but that should always be the work of the person themselves, never some sort of imposition by a therapist or not. He does that sometimes, yeah. Thank you all for this, for this conversation. I was, intrigued to see what you think of the material. So I'm glad that you engaged with it. So thanks.
Yeah, look, thanks, Peter. It's been Dr. Peter. It's been wonderful to have you with us. I really appreciate you taking the time to truck out to the wilds of the north. I think all of us have a lot more to think about now, and a lot of things to kind of never work out. So that's really the spiritual work, I think. And so I thank you very much for taking us deeper into that, and it's been wonderful to have you with us. So thanks.
Oh, good. No, I'd love to come back.
TheoCafe is officially closed.